Still working in the Griffin book on human rights, chapter 4, Whose Rights? And in this video, I'm looking at sections 4.3 and 4.4. Just so you know, I'm going to skip over 4.5. You can have a look at that on your own. In here, we're looking at a couple of things. We're looking at inferring from a moral weight to an HR, and Griffin is saying you can't really do that. Not that easily. You just can't automatically say something that has moral weight automatically has a human right. And also, he wants to take a little bit of a sidetrack on another issue, that a different way of looking at human rights, which is a needs-based account. And how does that relate to his personhood account? He thinks it's different, but there are resemblances, and we'll see that at the end of the video. So simply put, infants have, again, just because Griffin doesn't think that infants have human rights, that's not the same thing as saying they're unimportant. Remember, he's trying to put the brakes on equating moral importance and human rights, saying, oh, well, if something has moral importance, it has human rights. Obviously, if something has human rights, you would say it has moral importance, but you can't go the other way. So if you want to think about it as a kind of Venn diagram, if moral importance would be like sort of the big thing, with moral importance, and then human rights is like this, right? It's a subset. So if something has a human right, of course it's morally important, right? It's within the parameters of moral importance, but many things have moral importance, but they don't have human rights. The obvious one is, the environment that has moral importance, and he's wanting to say that, look, there's things that are extraordinarily important, like infants, but that doesn't mean they have human rights. So high moral weight, you just simply can't infer human rights. You have to look more at human rights, the account of it. Remember, going way back to the beginning, he wanted to determine the extension of the term human right, because the intention of it was awfully thin. And as I said in an earlier video, that I'm trying to drive this home, that if you are very thin on the intention of a term, the meaning, then its extension will balloon. And we saw that with the notion of sheer potentiality, sheer vulnerability. Like it's just gargantuan. All right. So it's so don't be shocked if Griffin says, yeah, infants don't have human rights, but they certainly are in this class of moral importance or moral weight or whatever you want to call it. And he thinks, as he said, like lots of things that are incredibly morally important are not necessarily an issue of human rights. All right, so you're just trying to get your head around his terminology. And let's look a little bit now at what falls under 4.4, the needs account. This is his side issue, but he wants to relate it to his own story because his is a personhood account. So remember, if you're in favor of human rights, what's the basis for it? You can be challenged on that. And so just the idea of the concept of human rights, that's not just a species, that's a genus. There's different ways to ground human rights. Well, this is one that tries to ground or base human rights not on personhood, but on needs. And schematically, a need structure is X needs A to phi, right? These are, three little variables. So this is kind of like, as mathematicians like to say, this is a function with different arguments in it. So what you want to spell out, formally, right? It would look something like this. Now, Griffin thinks that in the end, he's going to conclude, it's kind of sort of a little bit to get your head around. At the end of this section, he's going to include that he's going to say that his own account, the personhood account, is very similar to a needs-based account. But he's going to first, before he sort of brings them together, he's going to show that they're nonetheless, they are distinct. So he says the problem with a needs account is that in the end, and he goes through a little bit of a discussion to get to this point, but he really thinks that needs accounts point in the wrong direction. that they point to normal functioning, that they're a little bit too tied to bodily stuff, right? And so needs accounts are really about, your human rights are kind of a negative thing. It's sort of a negative kind of right. So it should be the avoiding of things that get in the way of normal functioning. So avoiding things, and he gives a nice discussion of these three issues, like avoiding ailments and avoiding harm, avoiding malfunction. So this is tied to the notion of a kind of normal functioning. And of course, the minute you bring in that term normal, I mean, lots of things break loose because how do you define this term? How do you, what are you talking about when you say normal human, normal functioning, right? And this problem of functional notions goes back to, right back to Aristotle when he was having sort of virtue and trying to articulate it in terms of human functions, right? What does that mean as a normal human function? But he says, something similar, this sort of orientation, he thinks conflicts with some of our intuitions about human rights. Because, and he gives a couple examples, and I'm just pulling one of them out here. But, here's one. You have the sniffles, he says, and society refuses to treat your sniffles. Well, your body's not functioning normally. But again, so normally you don't have the sniffles. This is a kind of ailment in a way. It's a kind of malfunction. Your nose is not supposed to be doing that. And the society refuses to treat your sniffles. Well, technically, it's not looking after your needs, right? So this seems to be, is this a violation of a human right if I'm sniffly and I don't get my sniffles treated? Like, do others have an obligation to help with my sniffles? And this gets you off on this problem of sort of the wrong orientation in the first place. And he thinks that this conflicts with our intuitions. We say, no, that's not really a human rights violation. So now he wants to then say, well, look, these needs, they generate lists. And he admits that his own proposal of a personhood account, right? Functioning as a normative agent, you're going to need, there are certain needs that have to be met for people to be normative agents. So simply, even if infants don't have, normativity, or they don't have the ability to function as normative agents, how do they get that? We'll talk about that in a second. But there are things that adults need in order to function as normative agents. You can't just do it without oxygen, right? There are things that are just going to be built into the very, shall we say, infrastructure that supports some kind of normativity or an ability to be normative, or that is set up, ideas and evaluate them of the good life and then pursue them. So he admits that his personhood account, in fact, yeah, it will generate a certain a list. Okay, so I just said, okay, from the personhood account, and this little arrow generates a list. So the little PA subscript here, the list of the personhood account. Yes, it does generate a list too. So in that sense, you're going to, X needs A in order to be a normative agent. So it's going to have a kind of, the personhood account is going to have a structural similarity to the needs-based account because personhood requires things, right? It can't exist in a vacuum. And so in that sense, it's roughly kind of similar to a needs account, which will also generate a list, an NA needs account. So you have two lists, one from the personhood account and one from the needs account. But what Griffin says is that the important difference here is that the list of needs that are generated by the personhood account is much, much smaller, right, than the needs account, right? Because, something like this, it might violate an HR based on needs, right? Sniffles violates HR based on needs, but sniffles would not violate an HR based on the list over here. So in that sense, you've got, he thinks, a more pragmatic approach. And remember, we haven't talked about the metaphysics of human rights yet. That's coming in a later chapter, so we'll see how that adds to Griffin's picture. But right now, there is a pragmatic dimension to it. He wants to keep the list small, and we've seen Griffin talk like this quite a bit. Remember when he was talking about, Kantian notions that, or the Kantian notion of freedom will generate a whole pile of natural rights or human rights, much bigger than the Enlightenment list of natural rights or human rights. And so Griffin is wanting to, again, part of his desire to put the brakes on this extension of the term human rights, because he thinks it's just ballooning. So he wants, so it's a kind of a pragmatic consideration that the list that is generated by the personhood account is smaller, better focused than the list that is generated by a needs account. And on that basis, this is a preferable way to go.